Between the August of 1941, that being the early stages of Operation Barbarossa, and the June of 1942, that being the acceleration of Operation Reinhard, the Nazi policy towards the Jews of Europe radicalized significantly, especially for those situated in the Soviet Union, also known as the Ostjuden. From September 1941, Adolf Hitler approved the mass deportations of the Reich Jews east, resulting in transports to the ghettos at Riga, Minsk and Lodz. Whether or not resettlements east, or deportations east, were at this point in the September of 1941 intended to be synonymous with mass murder, is not entirely clear, and the survival of lots of these Jews until late 1941, early 1942, suggests the notion that annihilation was not a concrete plan at this point. Eventually, most of these 1941 transports would have been liquidated during the Rambula massacre, or at the Maly Trostenets and Helmut extermination camps, but most were spared from annihilation in the autumn of 1941, with a notable exception being the liquidation of a transport sent to Kaunas. The autumn 1941 period is especially interesting for the historians of the Holocaust, given that it was during this period that the radicalization towards localized genocide, which would later be extended to a European-wide scale in 1942, commenced. But what the exact plan was for the Jews of Europe during this autumn 1941 period is still rather mysterious, and hotly debated today. In the eyes of a Second World War or Holocaust historian, autumn 1941 perhaps marks the most important period in the transition to what we now understand to be the final solution. During these autumnal months, localized genocide was realized across Eastern Europe. By November 1941, both Belzec and Chelmno were under construction, with the latter opening on December 8, 1941, the first of Nazi Germany's extermination camps to become operational. Plans were also in place for the construction of extermination camps at both Riga and Sobibor. However, following the events of the Rambula massacre, the necessity for an extermination camp near Riga was largely rendered redundant. However, the plans for an extermination camp near the village of Sobibor still went ahead, and it was opened in the April of 1942. Plans were also likely in place for the construction of a death camp near Minsk towards the end of 1941, with Maly Trostenets commencing formal construction in the January of 1942. In other words, the idea of localized genocide seemed to prevail during the autumn of 1941. However, this quickly extended to a European-wide scale in 1942, following the events of the Wannsee Conference and the initiation of Operation Reinhard. Although seldom discussed when compared to Poland, the Holocaust in the Soviet Union, and Belarus more specifically, also saw a turn towards localized genocide, starting with mass shootings in the summer of 1941. However, it wasn't just mass shootings that the SS had in mind for Belarus, as the region actually had plans for 2 extermination camps at the end of 1941. Now, this might be surprising for some, as the generally accepted notion is that there were only 6 Nazi extermination camps, namely Auschwitz, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek, Sobibor, and Treblinka. None of these camps lay in Belarus, so my claim that the SS had plans for 2 in this region might sound a little far-fetched. Well, the Holocaust in Belarus, and the Soviet Union more generally, is a topic that was largely ignored in the decades following the end of the Second World War, the attention only really coming to the subject in the 1990s, following the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. As such, piles of documents and information recorded by the Soviets and the Nazi atrocities were then uncovered, and with them, fascinating revelations were discovered. One of these extermination camps was the aforementioned Maly Trostenets, established in January 1942 near Minsk, which was largely ignored by Western historians, with some niche exceptions, until Paul Kohl's monograph on the camp in 2003. During its roughly 2 years of operation, Maly Trostenets murdered around 65,000 people, either by mass shootings or gas fans. It is largely the obscurity and mystery surrounding the camp that has led to its absence on the contemporary lists of all the Nazi extermination camps, or, at the very least, that's what I believe. My defense of Maly Trostenets as an extermination camp will be covered in my series on the camp itself, which will be coming out in 2026. But Maly Trostenets wasn't the only site in the Nazi-occupied district of Weißruthenian that was also envisioned as a potential location for an extermination camp. It is also highly likely that the SS had plans to construct a much larger, Majdanek-esque extermination camp in the city of Mogilev. Such plans for an extermination camp in the city of Mogilev were largely unknown until the advent of a very interesting paper by Christian Gerlach in the late 1990s, titled, quote, "Failure of Plans for an SS Extermination Camp in Mogilev, Belorussia." Unquote. In this paper, Gerlach utilizes a large number of primary sources, which strongly converge on the notion that a large extermination camp was planned to be constructed in Mogilev, by first transforming the city's labour camp into an extermination facility. Mogilev, although little known by the public at large today, was actually a major site of the Holocaust, and the so-called Mogilev labour camp, although it never formally transitioned into an extermination camp, could be put into a similar bracket to the extermination camp in Semlin, which is an argument that will be discussed throughout the scope of this mini-series. But before I delve into the interesting what-if aspect of the Holocaust, it is crucial to consider what was going on in Mogilev in late 1941, and in particular, how the city already had a gas chamber, but not one designed for Jews. You see, it is estimated that at least 17,000 psychiatric patients were murdered by the Germans during their occupation of the Soviet Union. While the exact number is not known, we can confirm the cases in instances where we have the records of the murders, and the psychiatric hospital at Mogilev is an excellent example of this. Our best source materials for the reconstruction of these murders come from the preliminary proceedings against Georg Frentzel, who was a driver for Einsatzkommando 8, one of the SS murder squads that would follow the advancing Wehrmacht, to ensure security behind the front. Mogilev, a town of roughly 100,000 people, 250 kilometers east of Minsk, was taken by the Wehrmacht on July 26, 1941, during their triumphant march across the Soviet Union in the early stages of Operation Barbarossa. Einsatzkommando 8 had reached Minsk on July 8, 1941, with Georg Frentzel in tow. After extorting the Jewish locals in Minsk for their valuables, Einsatzkommando then advanced to Mogilev, where they made their permanent residence on September 9, 1941. In Einsatzkommando 8, there were about 90 men, including 30 to 40 police officers. Initially employed as a driver of the Sanka, or ambulances, in August 1941, Frentzel was promoted to the post of personal driver of Adolf Prieb, who served Einsatzkommando 8 as their chief interpreter. Until early December 1941, Frentzel drove Prieb throughout Mogilev, including to the local psychiatric hospital, on several occasions. Although not officially part of the Aktion T4 euthanasia program, which saw the sterilization and murder of disabled people across the Reich, the murders of the mentally ill in the Soviet Union were an ideologically adjacent action. In a similar manner to the mentally retarded, or idiots, the psychiatric patients in Mogilev were considered to be useless mouths, people who stood in the way of the Wehrmacht's food and economic policy objectives. Given that these people often couldn't work, they were of no use to the SS, and hence merely a burden to them. Therefore, Einsatzkommando 8 put pressure on the Mogilev City Council to alleviate such issues, which the chief physician recalled at Frentzel's trial, a man who went by the name of Stepanov. Stepanov recalled the following at the trial, quote, "About 3 weeks before the annihilation of the first group of patients, which was done by gas poisoning in the gas chamber, I called on the head of the medical department of the Mogilev City Council, a man who also went by the name of Stepanov, and told him of the instruction that I had received, namely to draw up a list of all the patients who were in the hospital for the insane, and to specify the diagnosis of the disease and the state of health of each and every patient." Unquote. Owing to supply problems in Mogilev, Stepanov continued, quote, "There was an unwillingness to continue to provide for such a large number of patients. The patients incapable of working were supposed to be evacuated to other areas. Those fit for work were to be incorporated into the work activities, which, presumably, would result in their relocation to the Mogilev labor camp, and recently diagnosed sufferers were allegedly included in the food supply. In the end, just under 1,500 patients, including children, were divided into the following categories. 550 were chronically ill and incapable of work, 550 were chronically ill and capable of work, and 400 were recently diagnosed sufferers in need of treatment. Unquote. This list was then handed over to the Mogilev City Council, and just 1 week later, roughly 4 members of Einsatzkommando 8 entered the psychiatric hospital to seek out a room for the gassings. These men decided upon the surgery room in Hospital Building number 10. However, before the mass murder of patients in the hospital took place, there was apparently something of a trial run. This trial run was historically verified following the discovery of a film found in the Berlin apartment of SS Gruppenführer Arthur Nebe, following the end of the Second World War. The experiment in Mogilev wasn't Nebe's first, as he had already tried to kill roughly 24 patients of the Minsk Psychiatric Hospital with explosives in a nearby forest. In mid-September 1941, Nebe and his men lured the victims into a bunker in the woods, which was then blown up. When some of the patients who had survived the blast crawled out of the bunker, covered in blood and screaming, they were then returned to it and killed with an even bigger explosive charge. Unsurprisingly, the further usage of explosives was subsequently rejected, as this killing method was unsafe for the perpetrators and wholly unpleasant for all involved, as the widely scattered body parts would have to be collected. After such a disastrous experiment in Minsk, Nebe then continued on to Mogilev, where he experimented with something a bit different. In advance of his visit, which was 2 days after he had visited Minsk, Einsatzkommando 8 had selected a suitable test room for Nebe's experimental gassing. A day before he arrived, the windows of this room had been bricked up, and 2 pieces of pipe were inserted into the wall, connecting to 2 car parking spaces outside of the hospital, in which a car or truck's exhaust could be attached. The next day, Nebe arrived, and 2 vehicles were attached to each of the pipes extending out of the prototype gas chamber. One of these vehicles was a car, and the other a truck. After both vehicles had been fastened in, the nurses led the victims into the gas chamber. Given that these patients were more than familiar with their caregivers, they went obediently and unsuspectingly to their deaths. According to the Regional Court of Stuttgart in the trial against SS Sturmbannführer Albert Widmann, who was present at both the Minsk and Mogilev gassings, an unknown number of men and women died a long and cruel death by suffocation. Nebe's aforementioned film sequence apparently originates from this specific operation. This harrowing tape shows not only scantily clad men and women who were led to the building by nurses, but also 2 cars whose exhaust pipes were connected to a tube protruding from the wall by means of a hose. One of the vehicles seen in this film was an Adler car, which is the exact make of the vehicle in which Widmann had travelled to Belarus. Apparently, the car was initially utilised alone, but was found to be insufficient, so a truck was later utilised, and its exhaust fumes proved potent enough to murder those inside. Satisfied with the results of this experiment, Nebe confirmed to himself that stationary gas chambers could be erected and utilised almost anywhere, provided that a large enough vehicle, presumably a truck, could have its exhaust rigged into the gas chambers themselves. This model, albeit slightly adapted, as it only included the motor and exhaust, was then utilised in the Operation Reinhard death camps of Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka. Despite this provisional gas chamber being designed for Nebe's experiment, it was used after this initial gassing, as part of Mogilev's first action against the mentally ill. This minor action, which commenced in late September 1941, involved the aforementioned Georg Frentzel, the driver of Einsatzkommando 8. Before this action against the mentally ill began, Frentzel recalls how a group from the Mogilev ghetto were taken by truck to the nearby village of Polakovici. Similar to how Serbian prisoners would wait at the pits of Avala to receive the corpses of Jews annihilated in the Semlin extermination camp, the Jews from Mogilev would stand at the pits of Polakovici to receive the corpses of the mentally ill. A small contingent of young, strong Jewish men were also taken to the Mogilev psychiatric hospital itself, to assist in the gassings. Frentzel recalled that there were two metal pipes inserted at knee height in the building, to which they connected to the exhaust pipes of the parked vehicles, which converges perfectly with the reality of Nebe's tape. He then observed that the patients clothed in only a shirt or smock were brought from the other buildings into the extermination area in groups of 5 to 20, sometimes even more. In each gassing, 60 to 80 patients were crammed into the gas chamber. Frentzel remarked that the patients were weak and starving, going on to say that, quote, "Going by the appearance of the patients, they weren't in very good shape. They were extremely emaciated and virtually feeble. They were a terrible sight." Unquote. Natalia Nechina Kashovka, an employee in the psychiatric hospital, was in an adjoining room during the gassings, and she recalled the following, quote, "You could hear the loud wailing and screaming of the victims. When the bodies were carried out of the gas chamber, almost all of them had an unnatural posture. They were contorted, their clothes torn, as they had clawed each other in their death throes. Their veins stood out, their faces had turned purple." Unquote. On that day in late September or early October, it was not just the patients of the Mogilev institution who were murdered, but also the patients housed in the, quote, "colony for the insane," unquote. After the trucks had driven the dead bodies to Polokovici and dumped them there, the proxy Jewish Sonderkommando were loaded onto the empty trucks and taken to the main hospital, where, according to Frentzel, they were also annihilated in the gas chamber. At the end of this first murder campaign, Stepanov stated in 1948 that a German officer, presumably Adolf Prieb, gave a speech to the staff at the psychiatric hospital. He told his audience that, quote, "They, that being the Germans, were also carrying out such exterminations in Germany as well, since the annihilated patients were of no use to anyone, neither to themselves nor to others. This category of people were only to be destroyed." Unquote. The precise number of victims of the murder campaign in late September 1941 is still unknown. Concerning the total number of victims, Stepanov stated that in the first action, the following were annihilated. Roughly 650 people, all chronically ill, whether able to work or not, and all mental patients of Jewish nationality without exception, regardless of their stage of disease. This presumably also included the members of the small Jewish Sonderkommando that were involved in burying the bodies at Polokovici. Also, according to Stepanov, around 300 to 350 patients were exempted from Einsatzkommando 8's first killing action. Supposedly, these people were to be treated further, but the files present at Georg Frentzel's trial do not elaborate on what that entailed exactly. Around this time, the plans to transition the Mogilev labour camp into an extermination camp were still looking possible for the SS. However, difficulties in deportations, which will be covered in depth in part 2 of this mini-series, ultimately prevented such a transformation. Ergo, Einsatzkommando 8 could turn its attention back to the psychiatric patients of Mogilev, resulting in yet another action in the January of 1942. During this second action, Chief Dr. Stepanov claimed to have only learned of the murderous plans of Einsatzkommando on the same day that his patients were murdered. However, one of his matrons recalled that, on either January the 19th or January the 20th, 1942, the Germans had once again entered the hospital and measured how thick the walls of the building were. This same matron then informed Dr. Kuvshinov, who thereupon discharged from his ward about 40 patients who were able to orient themselves back to their families, in the hope that they would avoid annihilation. According to Frentzel, Einsatzkommando 8 was informed of the action the day before it took place. However, this seems fairly unlikely, and it was actually far more likely that it was just the grunts of Einsatzkommando 8, of which Frentzel was certainly a member, who would be informed on such short notice. During the course of this second action, Frentzel and the other drivers of Einsatzkommando 8 were divided up as sentries and formed, with the support of policemen, a cordon outside the walls of the institution, which was interspersed with boards. This security measure was designed not only to prevent patients from escaping, but also to prevent potential onlookers. During the course of the January 1942 action, It is unclear as to whether the makeshift gas chamber in the Mogilev hospital was ever used, but it is very interesting to note how Einsatzkommando 8 entered the facility to once again check the thickness of the walls. What we do know is that the victims of this action were driven to and shot by Einsatzkommando 8, who were now waiting for them near the Pashkovo village outside Mogilev. Frentzel recalled the physical conditions of these people during his trial. Quote, "It's also true to say, like with the patients executed in the first action, that they were lean. That's to say, they were emaciated. They were just skin and bones. Although it was extremely cold and there was a lot of snow on the ground, the patients were driven to their deaths without any clothing." Unquote. Rather curiously, Frentzel also alluded to how Einsatzkommando 8 were given lots of alcohol to, quote, "keep them warm," unquote, during the actions. But, in all likelihood, the real reasoning was as its use as a numbing agent. The proliferation of alcohol usage by perpetrators during the Holocaust is staggering, and is only something that has really been looked into more recently. Einsatzkommando 8's usage of alcohol during these actions is yet another instance where I've now seen it mentioned. Alcohol's prevalence among the SS during the mass shootings, roundups, and in the extermination camps themselves is a very understudied aspect of the Holocaust, and actually, genocide more widely. During the course of the second action, it is also rather unclear as to how many patients were murdered exactly. Frentzel stated that the trucks had travelled back and forth between the institution and Pashkovo, quote, "several times," unquote. He continued to argue that, quote, "if it had been a matter of a few patients, then such an effort would surely have not have been necessary," unquote. Once this final action against the mentally ill had concluded, Einsatzkommando 8 plundered the psychiatric hospital, which was no longer in need of its supplies, given that all its patients had now been murdered. In its place, a field hospital for the Wehrmacht was established, with the medical employees of the psychiatric hospital being rehired to now treat wounded German soldiers. During the course of 1943, as the war turned against the Germans in the east, it became apparent to SS Chief Heinrich Himmler that the Soviets could, and most likely would, advance far enough to uncover the crimes of the SS. Therefore, the corpses that littered Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, whether that be at the sites of mass shootings, the extermination camps, or at the sites of minor actions, must be removed. Hence, the campaign to obfuscate genocide, codenamed Action 1005, was implemented in Belarus in 1943, and Mogilev was no exception. Stefan Ivanovich Pilunov, a captured partisan, was forced to aid in the implementation of Action 1005 in Mogilev. He recalled that he and other detainees in the Mogilev prison were loaded onto military trucks and first taken to Pashkovo, where the SS forced them to dig up the corpses, while other prisoners had to dig shallow pits for their incineration and chop wood for a pyre. This open-air oven was in operation for roughly a month, but wasn't entirely effective. Paul Blobel, who was in charge of Action 1005, was far more interested in its implementation at the extermination camp at Maly Trostenets, and he had somewhat neglected the importance of Mogilev. Therefore, upon the recapturing of the city by the Red Army, the Soviet Extraordinary State Commission came across the mass graves around Mogilev, with some of the victims either entirely unburnt or only partially. On December the 10th, 1971, after a trial that had lasted for over 2 years, Georg Frentzel was sentenced to life imprisonment for both war crimes and crimes against humanity. Although not a mainstream trial by any means, the acknowledgement of the slaughter of the mentally ill around Mogilev at least brought the subject to light, and provided crucial evidence for the movements and actions of Einsatzkommando 8. Thanks for watching. In part 2 of this mini-series, I will discuss the plans to transform Mogilev's inner-city labour camp into a large Majdanek-esque extermination camp, so make sure to like and subscribe so that you don't miss out on the notification for part 2. As always, if you have any questions, simply let me know in the comments section down below. Other than that, have a great day, and I'll see you next time.